Now, I must first confess, you might have seen the results of our poll for the temperature by 2100, and I must confess that I'm deeply disappointed. I think our ambition with certainly the Energy Transition Hub is to focus on the opportunities, the optimism, and the positive story of the future. I think there were only two views that were consistent with the Paris Agreement target, where we are going to end up in 2100. So I think the idea of having annual bilateral meetings and symposiums to create a little bit more optimism is a good one. Anyway, without further ado, I would like to introduce the next session. We had the overarching context this morning. This session is about the vision forward, the scenarios for Australia and for Germany, with a little bit more detail and flesh on the bone. Allow me, however, to make first an introductory remark with my other hat on, which is I'm an IPCC lead author. We are currently working also on the carbon budgets. We are looking at the new climate models. A big story for the forthcoming IPCC assessment report that is going to come out in 2021, and in the lead up to that will certainly be that some climate models show a much higher climate sensitivity than previously. That is currently analyzed. We don't know the full reasons yet, but that will certainly be part of the mix of the debate. Of course, you always hear it was worse than we previously thought, but here there's a trend in climate sensitivity that really we had it almost constant for 3-4 decades, and now they're our best world's climate models from the best modeling centers, from the UK Modeling Center, from GFDL in Princeton, etc. They're coming out with climate sensitivities of 5 and 5.5 degrees, and that will certainly play out in the media at some stage. That is the one story over the next 6, 12, 18 months. The other story is, of course, where do we think we can go? And if I can just reflect back in 2007 in Noordwijkerhout at another IPCC meeting, we decided on the range of the scenarios for the AR5, and we had a very hefty debate on what is the lowest scenario, how low is still plausible. We had then came up with the RCP 2.6 scenario that is roughly consistent with a 2-degree target. It was considered to be at the bleeding edge of what models can do. 5 years later, 7 years later, we had the same debate again in Luxembourg for the new set of scenarios, which are now called SSP scenarios. The RCP 2.6 was by then considered a mainstream scenario, and now we were considering, is it at RCP 1.9 or 2.0 scenario rather at the lower edge. So the models always move forward. Why do they move forward? Also because they have new mitigation options in the mix, and a lot of the costs for renewable energies turn out lower than we anticipated just a few years ago. So that is the positive side, and also there will be the story that the challenge might be even bigger than we previously thought. And while we have the bad news and the good news, there's one fundamental here. And the fundamental is CO2, if we emit it today, stays in the atmosphere not for 100 years, not for 200 years, but basically it has not a finite lifetime. It stays in the atmosphere, is redistributed to the oceans, the land biomass, etc. But for thousands of years, we are going to increase the temperature of the Earth by a small amount for every single CO2 emission, and that is not going away, and CO2 is very different to the other greenhouse gases in that respect. So that is all to say, there is no way around net zero at some stage. No matter whether your climate target is 3 degrees, even if you want to limit global warming at 4 degrees with major impacts, and even more so, of course, with 1.5 and 2 degrees, but at some stage, we have to be at net zero, otherwise there's continuous warming in the decades and centuries to come. So the question is, how do we get to this net zero? What are the scenarios? And I'm very delighted that we have very eminent speakers for this session, which is about these scenarios and the futures. And we also have, you might wonder, why do we have now hydrogen experts also on the stage in this session, if we have since we have a next session on hydrogen? Well, hydrogen, as we heard this morning, is an absolutely necessity if you go to 100%. We heard it from Felix Mattes this morning. I think if you look at net zero, then hydrogen is in one form or the other part of the mix, and that's why I'm delighted also to have two hydrogen experts on the stage. Let me first welcome Dr. Carsten Wolle from the he was head of the Department of Energy and Raw Materials, where he developed the BDI's, the German Federation of Industries, raw materials strategy, and initiated the foundation of the Resource Alliance in the German industry. Dr. Carsten Wolle has been head of the Department of the Energy and Climate Policy of the Federation of German Industries in Berlin since 2013. He has been the Secretary General of the German Member Committee of the World Energy Council since 2005. Please join me in welcome Carsten Wolle. Our next guest on the podium is Professor Karen Pittel. Professor Karen Pittel is the director of the Center for Energy, Climate and Resources at the IFO Institute, one of the most renowned economic institutes in Germany. In addition, she is professor of economics at the University of Munich. She is a member of the German government's Advisory Council on Global Change since 2010 and was recently appointed to the steering committee of the science platform of the German Climate Protection Plan 2050. She advises industry and politics on energy and climate policy related issues. Please join me in welcoming Professor Karen Pittel. We then have Dr. Falko Uckert. Falko Uckert is the German motor behind the Energy Transition Hub on the German side. He's the managing director of the Energy Transition Hub. Since 2015, Dr. Uckert is part of the IEA advisory group on grid integration of variable renewables. In the past, he worked in energy planning for the International Renewable Energy Agency, 2014 and 2015, and in e-mobility for the Boston Consulting Group. He has been contributing author to the special report on renewable energies. He has also a background in physics and economics and conducts research and policy advice in the field of climate change mitigation, energy system transformation, wind and solar power integration, as well as the economics of the impacts of climate change. Please join me in welcoming Falko Uckert. Next is Dylan McConnell. To many in the Australian landscape, Dylan McConnell will be known to you from the media. Dylan has done his PhD at the Melbourne Climate and Energy College. He is one of the experts in the Australia, and this is his very detailed understanding of the cost structure in energy technologies and the market design of the Australian national electricity market. It's hard to get actually hold of him in the office, so that's why we are very delighted to have him here on stage. He also is one of, together with Simon Hauser-Kurt, one of the originators of opennem.org.au, the platform to visualize the current NEM electricity data. And just 2 days ago, we launched under the auspices of IT Power and together with UNSW and also helped by ARENA funding, OpenSEM, which is an open modeling platform where Dylan was instrumental to get that across. Please join me in welcoming Dylan McConnell. And then we have Daniel Roberts. Daniel Roberts is the director of the CSIRO Hydrogen Energy Future Science Platform and a CSIRO initiative driving new science and technology development in support of the emerging Australian hydrogen industry. Prior to his role, Daniel led the CSIRO thermal and electrochemical research programs, and he continues to play a senior role in CSIRO gasification R&D activities. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Roberts from CSIRO. And we have a second hydrogen expert, Attilio Pigneri. Attilio is a co-founder and CEO of H2U, a specialist developer of hydrogen infrastructure initiatives for sustainable mobility and the renewable energy storage. H2U is based in Australia and operating throughout Asia Pacific. Attilio is currently the president of the Australian Association for Hydrogen Energy and was the chairman of the successful World Hydrogen Technologies Convention. Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking Attilio Pigneri. Our first speaker for today is Professor Gunnar Luderer. Gunnar Luderer leads the Energy System Group at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. He's the lead scientist behind the REMIND Integrated Energy Economic Model. For those of you who don't know this is one of the integrated assessment model with which the IPCC makes the scenarios for 1.5, 2 degrees, and how much emission reductions we have to do. He was a lead author of the 2013 and 2018 UNEP emission gap reports, and a contributing author to the 5th assessment report, the IPCC special report on renewable sources, and also the special report on warming of 1.5 degrees, which just came out last year. He studied physics and economics and atmospheric sciences at the University of Heidelberg and Oregon State University, and he had his doctoral studies at MPE in Mainz at the Max Planck Institute there. So please join me in welcoming Gunnar Luder, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Malte, for this kind introduction. And welcome to this first presentation on global pathways for an energy transition towards limiting warming to below 2 degrees. To illustrate this carbon budget that Malte just pointed to and the urgency of the climate challenge, I put up this graph, actually produced by Malte and colleagues as part of an earlier German-Australian collaboration, and it shows the tightness or the urgency of the climate crisis. Because if you think of this carbon budget as a cake of the amount of CO2 emissions that we can still afford within this goal of limiting warming to 2 degrees, we've already eaten up 3/4 of this cake, which also means that there's only 1,000 gigatons left around for this 2-degree target, which corresponds to around 25 years of current emissions. So the big question is, can we pull this off? Can we still limit warming to 2 degrees? Yes, we can, but it really requires a very substantial turnaround in the way we supply and use fossil energy. Illustrated by an exemplary CO2 emission pathway from our Remind integrated assessment model, one of these pathways that achieves limiting warming to well below 2 degrees, and has a couple of key features which are very robust and across the entire class of such 2-degree mitigation scenarios. We really need a peak in emissions as soon as possible. We need steep emission reductions over the course of the next decades, and we have to get to net zero around mid-century. As Malte pointed out, this is the only way to limit warming from increasing further. To understand the energy system implications of that, it's very useful to decompose these emission pathways into different sectoral contributions. And the first thing to point out, the yellow part, the electricity system, is really playing a key role. It's a key pillar of making this energy transition happen. There we have a lot of the low-hanging fruits, the cheap options to reduce emissions. But then, if you want to get net zero, there is also the demand-side component. Currently, the combustion of fossil fuels in industry, transport, and buildings accounts for more than half of energy-related emissions, and there we see it's particularly difficult to really do without hydrocarbons, and this is what determines, to a large extent, the remaining fossil fuels that we have in the system, and with that also the achievability of these Paris climate targets and the amount of negative emissions that we would need from land use change or from biomass with CCS. So this is really should be a key focus of our energy transition efforts. Looking at the regional distribution of emissions in terms of per capita emissions, it's very important to note that Australia and Germany, the left two bars here, we are talking about 2 to 3 times more emissions on a per capita base than world average. So really we have a very important responsibility to take action on and lead this transition to net zero. Of course, this is a huge challenge, but it also comes with very significant opportunities. The first and most obvious one on that is renewable energy, very much illustrated by the pathways that we've seen over the last decade in solar PV development, where we've seen a robust growth of more than 20% per year, and we will have to sustain this rate of growth going over the next decades to make this deep electricity system decarbonization happen. That is an integral part of the climate stabilization strategy. And that has gone hand in hand with very significant cost reductions. This is examples of feed-in tariffs in Germany, and we've seen an almost 10-fold decrease in feed-in prices over only a decade, which illustrates the very, very dynamic innovation in this area. But there are also other things. One very important transformation that might be to some extent underappreciated is the role of electricity in the system. And that's illustrated by the development of final energy prices of electric versus non-electric energy carriers, as illustrated on the right-hand graph. The point here is that with the kinds of carbon prices that we need to make 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees achievable, we will see a tremendous increase, a significant increase in the costs of coal, oil, and gas. At the same time, electricity can decouple from that development because we have renewables to substitute fossil fuels. And that means at some point, electricity will become the cheapest energy carrier. But at the same time, of course, it also is the spread in prices increases tremendously because we have this variable nature of renewable electricity. What does that mean? It means that a fundamental premise on what our energy systems were built, that a high-value, high-price energy carrier in electricity will all of a sudden become very cheap, at least in the majority of hours of the year. And that might become very significant for electrification, not only mobility, I think very much also in stationary applications. And here's a number of industrial processes where we looked into current levels of electrification and then future electrification potentials, which are, from a technological perspective, quite significant and will become economically more and more attractive as these background developments happen. Third point, if we look at geographical distribution of renewable energy and energy demands, it's very interesting to consider GDP density per unit area in this graph. And you see that in some areas it's very, very high. It's a good indicator of also energy demand per unit area. Also we have a quite imbalanced picture on renewable energy supply. So what's very evident is that to make this transition happen, there's a big scope for new forms of energy trade emerging to make these renewable energy available in regions where they are scarce, while in others there's a huge supply. The big question that needs to be addressed, and I would argue it's largely unresolved, the jury is still out, is in what form or in what mix this renewable energy will be traded. Candidates are electricity, high voltage direct current lines are, for example, heavily built now by China. Synthetic fuels, that's a big focus of what we discuss here. Hydrogen, methane, methanol, different forms. And then a third aspect is energy-intensive materials. So steel, aluminum, chemical precursors, all that might play a very important role. And I think it's an exciting research topic how this plays out and what the economics of these different pathways is. With that, I would like to leave it and look forward to the further discussion.
I clearly underestimated the richness of the slides when I asked the next speakers to sit on the podium. So we go on the podium then maybe jointly later. Please welcome Carsten Wolle from BDI. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind invitation. Good morning from my side. In fact, I'd like to give a brief glance on the study project Holger Lösch already mentioned this morning in a sort of joint presentation together with Karen Pittel. My task is a little bit to give you a glance of our BDI study before Karen then will show and explain a little bit how that relates to similar study projects of Architect, of the German Energy Agency, as there's now, I think, some common ground that we found with the three studies, how the energy picture could look like in 2050, and what can be learned from that. Maybe it's worth explaining in the first minute, why does an industry organization like BDI does climate studies? I mean, when that was 3 years ago, I initiated this process because my perception was we were talking very much about targets, level of ambition, very much in detail, but there was hard feeling of what is really achievable, what is technologically achievable, what is economically feasible. And for that purpose, we try to find some common ground ourselves, as in the end, It's the economy, it's companies and engineers who actually make the innovations, have to build up what we call energy transformation. So it is quite worth setting up a process, not only doing some simulations and calculations, but really bringing in all the expertise from all the branches. And that's why we had a very extensive project with almost 200 experts from all branches of German industry being involved in 40 workshops to make sure whatever is projected and calculated is somehow plausible to those who really work on the subjects. And that was the study project Climate Pathways for Germany 2050. Now, let's see. Yeah. First results on our scenarios, and it's not projections, it's really scenarios that we were building. In the first place, like many, we had a reference scenario on how far do we actually get with the current policies in place. What is a quite reasonable outcome from what we can see if we would prolong that into the future. And that was, in fact, this reference path of roughly 60% CO2 reduction by 2050 compared to the 1990 levels, which is quite something, but which is, again, not what we aim towards the policy targets of 95 to 80%. So obviously there's a gap that has to be bridged. And what we do now in our study is how can we actually fill that gap in the most efficient way. So it's in cost optimization, taking all the technologies from today's perspective and look how we can close the gap, and this by a bird's perspective, by perspective of an economist looking down to Germany, not by the individual investor's perspective. So obviously there is a gap between what is economically feasible for Germany and what is feasible and profitable for the individual investor. So there would be a need for additional incentives, additional policies that have to be created in order to come there. So that has been already one of the assumptions, a very basic one, bird's perspective, cost optimization. Second one for us that was important, we assumed that there will be perfect carbon leakage protection, very important assumption from a business organization, really to take all the branches together. There were many, many other assumptions, maybe just to mention one more, perfect regulation, that's usually the one politicians laugh most when we present it, as they would say, well guys, you know us. But anyway, of course, it is a projection, not a simulation, it's the way we can handle it in this project. No, there should be another one, maybe. Okay, yeah. Now, how does Germany look like in this minus 80% world? What are the technologies that we will see in this scenario? 80% means a lot more of what we know today. A lot more renewables, a lot more efficiency, a lot more electrification when it comes to heat systems, 14 million heat pumps in Germany, a lot more electrification in passenger cars, that's 26 million electric vehicles, biomass being used in industry rather than in the heating processes. So there's a lot of technologies that we know already, but that has to be incentivized to really get there. It's not science fiction. It is possible, but it needs some assistance. That's the sectors and how that really relates to the different sector achievements. The power sector, you can read it, manufacturing industries, transport, buildings, and agriculture. And we looked at the whole picture to make sure that we can really achieve the minus 80% here. Now, minus 80% does not mean minus 80% for each and every sector. Obviously, abatement costs are different sector-wise. So this would mean there's sectors which is easier to achieve, power sector, a building sector, that relates to roughly 90% reduction, and other sectors where it is more expensive or more difficult as the technologies are not fully there, manufacturing industries, transport, and agriculture. So that's the way how we look on the 80% world. Now, what about the 95% world? And it turns out that this is really, again, a big step really something very much different, as this is not only a little bit more, but it's really different. 95% CO2 reduction for an economy like Germany means roughly full defossilization for power sector, for manufacturing industries, for transport, for buildings, as the last 5% would be mostly reserved for the agricultural sector, for the cows, so to speak. This gets clear if you look a little bit more in detail on the technologies. As I said, there is again more renewables, more efficiency, higher renovation rate in buildings, more e-vehicles and heat pumps, all of that. But beyond that, there's also some new technologies, different technologies that come into play, and that also cause different questions acceptance-wise, technology-wise. First of all, the topic of our week, of our delegation, it won't be possible without substantial imports of renewable fuels, probably hydrogen-based, whether it is liquid or gas. We came up with a figure of 340 terawatt hours of imports, which is, to translate that only into hydrogen, the complete German power sector being rebuilt somewhere abroad only for the purpose to produce hydrogen for Germany. That's the sheer size of what we're talking about if we talk about 340 terawatt hours. Second, there's a substantial amount of carbon capture and storage or carbon capture and use technologies that we are there. Without those, we won't be there, and we have, of course, quite some acceptance issues when it comes to these technologies in Germany. And last but not least, that's more maybe for laughing, but it shows that we have to go really very much to the end of everything that's known. Even in the agricultural sector, we would to reduce CO2 emissions quite substantially, and we've found the methane pill for cows. That would be a technology way to reduce emissions. You could also, of course, reduce the amount of cows, but it just shows we have to make use of each and every technology to achieve targets like this. It is really very, very ambitious. And that's the amount of CO2, of CCS technologies. That's an abatement curve with the cheapest and the most expensive technologies, how to fill the gap, and you end up here with technologies that would have been incentivized with CO2 prices of 400 euro per ton, so it gets quite expensive at the higher end of this column. Now, what does that mean for the electricity system? We've seen there is, of course, there are new consumers of electricity, heat pumps, electric vehicles, district heating. These are the orange ones that grow in the current policy scenario as well as in the 80% scenario. But in our cost-optimized scenarios, those are balanced out by the efficiency gains, substantial efficiency gains that have to come in place in all the other sectors in order to make sure that this is really a cost-efficient way. So in the end, that's the cost-optimal way. It's probably not the most probable way, but it's a way how actually the electricity demand is held more or less under control, and only with the very extreme scenario of 95%, we can't cope with that, so electricity demand goes up very much. On the supply side, we see wind in green, solar in yellow, very much the same in the current policy scenario as well as in the 80% scenario, substantial growth of renewables for electricity purposes. There's some gas going in here for the base load or for the flexibility, so to speak. And only with the 95%, this is a lot more, as we've seen on demand side already. What does that mean? And that's the final slide from my side. On the investment side, well, it means substantial additional investment for an energy transition from today to 2050. We came up with a figure of 1 trillion, sorry, that's the German billion, but it's 1.5 trillion euro for the whole way in all sectors, additional investment for industry, for power sector, transport, and buildings that would be needed to achieve the 80% target. If you would go for the 95%, it's even more, 2.3 trillion euro additional investment. This is quite a lot, but still, and we came as well up that this is and can be feasible if the right incentives are set, especially when it comes to the 80% pathway, as long as carbon leakage protection is there, as there's a level playing field, and as there's perfect regulation. All what we've said, it is achievable, and that's what we are aiming for. But we have to start now and make it most cost effective. And with this, I would hand it over to Karen, how this relates to the other studies. Thanks.
Hi, yeah, I'll continue this talk. There's less slides on my side, so won't be that long, I hope. Yeah, I'm going to present you some key results. I mean, there's of course much more. There's also an English version of our paper for that, that we will be able to send out. Key results from the comparison of 3 studies, which were all done in the time frame of 2017 to 18, so they're all about the same time. They were done by the so-called project Energy Systems for the Future. That's a project run by the 3 biggest Academy of Sciences in Germany. Then the study that we just saw from the German Federation of German Industries, and then the German Energy Agency. And the methodology behind the 3 studies were quite different. I mean, the first one we just heard about was a mix of like different models going kind of like, yeah, handing over results from one to the other, so about a number of models and workshops with experts from industry. The second one, which is now the energy system of for the future, was done mainly by academics, so it was completely independent in the sense of industry, and was also cost-efficient, calculated with one big model that included sector coupling, so heat, transport, and electricity, but focused much more on Germany. And then the third one of the German Energy Agency was less really on a cost efficiency side, but it was more done with consultations of industry, of members of the German Energy Agency about what they thought was plausible scenarios. So perhaps that a little bit as a background that of course then also translates in very different assumptions made for the different models. And I'll just name a couple during when I'm going through the slides. The first one that shows basically the range of uncertainty we're faced with and also the policy dependency for the future is the projections for the expansion of wind and PV systems in Germany. So that's like the main source of renewable energy that we will be using in the future, at least domestic. And we see that the energy systems of the future, for the future, actually has very high projections, wide range as well. But you see that goes up to about 600 gigawatt in solar and wind alone, and that's about the max. I mean, that's almost beyond the max of what many people actually think is possible in Germany. So that's a technological perspective. That doesn't say that that would be accepted by the population. That's lots of windmills, that's lots of solar installations. But also the Energy Systems for the Future project assumed or tried actually to come up with a scenario that was relying on Germany only also to produce synthetic fuels. So we don't have any imports in there. So that's basically the consequence, what you see here. But then also the different projects had different assumptions about energy efficiency development, about costs, obviously. So that basically then resulted in very different scenarios. Down there at the 100, about 100, you see where we are at the moment in gigawatt expansion, wind and PV. And so that would mean at least a doubling up to kind of a 6-fold increase over what we have today. Basically, the different assumption can also be seen then in the dispatchable power generation capacity needed in the future. So the first one you see, that's the reference scenario. That's for all about minus 60%, kind of like a current policy scenario. And then you see for the BDI, the DINA, and the ESA study, the different scenarios. So we just had a 90% scenario, so not 95. That would have then probably exceeded the limits also of wind and solar in Germany. But you see that compared to what the baseline scenario projects, there's a little less, but also a little more possible with respect to dispatchable power, what we need in the future. So that's quite a lot. That's, of course, a lot of capacity running at very low load. So just a couple of hours per year. Also then, of course, raises questions about incentive structures. Then this is probably the slide that's most of most interest in the context of the current topic for the day. That's actually the use of synthetic energy carriers in Germany. And you see here in the ASIS scenario that that's, of course, the least, because that's all domestic production. And, of course, there's limits to what we can actually produce at home. And then you see that in the BDI numbers, that was the numbers that Carsten Rolle just presented. But you also see that in the DENA scenario, the TM95 is a technology mix scenario, which is called technology mix, but it's quite heavy on the hydrogen. Like I said, it's not really a cost-efficient optimization. There's also very different cost assumptions behind the different scenarios, especially in this context. And so you see that it's like what we are actually importing in the TM95 scenario is more than we're actually using in electricity at the moment, which is about 600 terawatt hours per year. So that is quite a lot. Yeah, of course, the study is not only focused on electricity, because of course we won't get to anywhere near carbon neutrality or 80% or 95% if you just focus on electricity only. It's a good starting point, and there will be lots of electrification in the other sectors as well. But as we have already heard, there won't be electricity-only scenario for the future. We will need different types of fuels. And that's kind of nicely reflected also in these results for different driving systems in the future. So on the very right side, you see one hand for cars, on the other hand for trucks and light commercial vehicles, the 2050 numbers, and you see that kind of all scenarios agree that at least half of what is going to be on the roads of these kind of vehicles is going to be powered by some type of electric system. So it could be direct electric, could be battery electric, could be hybrid, but then it's also quite a proportion of fuel cell powered vehicles. What we don't have on the slide, partially because it was not dealt with in all studies, but also because of the large uncertainty we're actually still facing, is heavy trucks. I mean, there's kind of like the decision still not clear between electrification, like overhead power lines even, synthetic fuels, methane, whatever, so hydrogen. So basically, we don't have a slide on that. And then the third part, barring land use, is actually heating. I mean, for Germany, that's quite a substantial share of the energy use. That's about 40%. And you see actually here just the numbers for the refurbishment of houses or buildings in general that would be necessary actually to get to the 95 or 90% percent reduction scenarios. Of course, that's just one side. On the other hand, you of course need also for the remaining energy that's needed, you need a defossilization as well. So there's going to be in the background kind of a switch from fossil fuels to heat pumps on the one hand, and also heat storage networks, for example. But the decisive kind of thing also for German politics is that we have been hovering around a rate of refurbishment of like 0.5% per year for a very long time, and we see that we would need at least 1.4 to up to 2.0% per year. I mean, it can't be more or less only a linear increase because there's also restrictions to the number of specialists, for example, that can do something like that. But it's actually quite a challenge as well that's sometimes forgotten in all the hype about new technologies in electricity and also in transport. But it's a very important component, and I guess for Australia as well, having seen the numbers also of emissions, I think it was 40% generated in buildings and heating. I'm hoping I'm right with the numbers here. And then perhaps finally, I think it's one more chart. That's just the projections of the cost, additional over the baseline scenario. And what you can see here quite clearly is, again, the wide range that the different studies came up with. So they're basically ranging between 15 trillion per year to 70 trillion per year, so about 0.5 to 2% of the German gross national product, but one also has to say we're currently spending about 25 trillion per year for the German Renewables Energy Act only. So it's not out of range. I mean, that definitely has to be said. This includes investment cost, financing of investment, operational costs, as well as the import of fossil energy carriers. It does not include, and that has to be stressed, any value-added effects. It does not include employment effects, so all the positive sides of this transformation are not included. So this is just the challenge of raising the necessary, especially investment, kind of redirecting investment into these fields from other fields and potentially raising more investment. You also see the very high number for the ESA's scenario here, and that's of course then again partially driven by the efforts taken to actually produce also the electricity for synthetic energy carriers at home. So that is actually part of that. I mean, we discuss in the study also the import, but that really shows how kind of cost inefficient that is, although in the system itself it was cost efficient. If you do make the assumption that there are no imports, then it's cost efficient. But compared to a scenario where you actually open up, it's not sufficient, cost efficient anymore. So some very short key takeaways. I mean, in the studies, there's of course dozens of policy recommendations, which we cannot really show all, but these are kind of like the most important things. They're pretty general, but I think they're nevertheless, they should never be forgotten. Yeah, on the one hand, although there's a lot of discussion about investment needs, they are high, depending on the policy, but they're not insurmountable. There's also lots of benefits to be had. So you have to calculate with the value added. I mean, there's export potentials to be had, which again depend on policy frameworks. So it's not something that you get by itself. So what's actually required is a really, kind of, I hate that, smart policy mix. Everything has to be smart, but in that case, it really has to be smart. But it has to be especially long run, and it has to be reliable. So there's little things that are more detrimental to following a long-term goal than regulatory uncertainty, so self-induced uncertainty. I mean, some uncertainties you just have to live with, climate uncertainty, technology uncertainty, but some stuff you make yourself, and that's basically one of the problems. Also, we need a policy mix, obviously. I mean, carbon pricing, in many people's view, many economists' view especially, has to be the backbone of this kind of long-run goals, but then we need additional policies for infrastructure, for innovation. I mean, there's incentives for that, but there's also private incentives, but there's especially also path dependencies to be overcome. That is not that easy just with marginal steps. And perhaps for me, one of the biggest takeaways, and that kind of like adds to what Felix Matte said before, is really just not think about the next step only. Not only, I mean, until last year or the year before, we thought about 2020 mainly. Then as we saw that we won't meet the 2020 goals, we start thinking about 2030, but kind of like thinking about what can be done to reach that goal. And kind of forgetting that if we just reach that goal, we might actually implement infrastructure, technologies that won't get us to 2050. Because many of the things that we do might be refurbishment, might be new industrial installations, even buying a car, that has long-run consequences, there's long investment cycles. So we have to think already today about the 2050 goals and not just what we need for 2030. I think that's one big lesson to be learned. It's really the long run that counts. And that, of course, then raises a big dilemma for policy between uncertainty on the one hand and commitment on the other hand. On the one hand, you don't want to face infrastructure lock-ins that are potentially very costly if you kind of like put all your horses on the wrong technology. But on the other hand, you can't postpone forever. Procrastination is very expensive as well. So finding the right mix and putting your money on the right technologies, that is a quite hard decision to face especially by politicians. I mean, we can just give advice, and even we are not completely certain. Yeah, and The final thing is just really stressing again, we need global efforts. I mean, like Carsten Rolle said, many things depend really also on what happens around you. You cannot really do everything yourself, but it also depends on what incentives are set outside of your own world. That is carbon pricing, that's technologies, etc. That's also support for perhaps developing countries for them to get on a clean path. So that's a whole range of issues. But it's extremely important. I think it's just here is the right place. I mean, being from two polar opposites geographically on this world, I think it's really important to stress that at a location or as an event like this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And with that roadshow of German scenarios, that was fascinating. And just ending on that last point, it needs global efforts. It needs even more. When we think about the bright blue graphs of all the 340 terawatt hours to be imported, it needs not only global efforts, it needs global cooperation so that we can lift this energy trade, renewable energy trade up with supply and demand on the same time scale. With that, thank you very much for the German overview. Now we switch over to the Australian scenarios, and Dill McConnell, you have the stage.
All right, thanks, Malta. Yeah, so I will be, I guess, representing the Australian side of a group modelling effort as part of the Energy Transition Hub. We've got about 12 working groups, and one of them is has been around modelling transitions in the Australian energy system. So I guess now you'll see a roadshow of different Australian scenarios. Yeah, there's probably 20-odd individual researchers from across countries and across institutions that have been involved in this. We've used 4 models, including Remind, which Gunnar mentioned earlier, another German model, and two Australian models to basically analyse transition scenarios in the Australian context as well. And this stuff is pretty hot off the press as well. So yeah, there's a report floating around if you want any more details, or we don't go into as much detail as you might like in the presentation. First of all, I guess I'm going to talk about the setup, the scenarios we've modelled, and some of the results, and then I'm going to hand over to the German counterpart, Falco, to talk through some more results. But first of all, yeah, we sort of came up with 4 main scenarios to look at. One of them, at one end of the spectrum, is essentially the no policy or the status quo, business as usual scenario, and then various degrees of increasing ambition down towards what we've called a leadership scenario, which is a fair departure from, I guess, where we're currently at today. I won't go into the details of each of those different scenarios, but needless to say, there's basically increasing electrification, increasing decarbonisation across the economy, as you go down those 4 scenarios. And perhaps, I guess, most interestingly for this group and the previous discussion, was looking at 2 what we're calling accelerated scenarios that we're looking at exports on top of the big domestic decarbonisation scenario. 2 of them in particular, and one of them is this so-called 200% renewable energy scenario. That is a very, very ambitious scenario, and that's essentially, we're effectively doubling our domestic electricity consumption through electrification and of the rest of the economy, and then doubling that again to then provide electricity or energy for export. And funnily enough, the amount that we're talking about exporting, 426 terawatt hours in various forms, sounds very similar to the amount that the Germans were talking about importing. I think that was somewhat coincidental. I guess importantly, our export, we actually broke down that particular amount of export into different categories, not just hydrogen. So 50% of that is in the form of hydrogen, but also in the form of value-added minerals. So basically emissions-intensive mineral, things like aluminium, steel smelting and that sort of stuff make up the other 50%. So yeah, it's not just hydrogen in this particular scenario that we've, these scenarios we've looked at. I guess, here's a quick, I guess, snapshot of the different scenarios the results from the different scenarios. The scenario numbers are down the bottom, and different years from multiple models here. The key takeaway, or the most important observation here, is that regardless of the scenario, the energy system is going to be dominated by wind and solar, and that seems fairly consistent with the results we just saw from our German counterparts as well. The key driver behind this is actually around the exit of coal in the status quo scenario, actually in all the scenarios. And essentially, the question is not so much where we end up, it's when we end up. It's a matter of speed and when these the coal plants exit, because essentially, yeah, as it's no surprise to everyone in the audience here, wind and solar are the lowest cost form of new generation. The question is a matter of timing and how that is essentially firmed up. I think I'll now pass over to my colleague, Falco, to continue going through some of our results. Thanks.
I want to stress first one major difference to the German system, and that is that renewables are really competitive in Australia already. And that is not only because the generation costs are falling below those of fossil generation, but also the integration costs, so the costs of balancing demand and supply, do not overshoot. So adding generation and integration costs makes renewables still competitive. So the integration costs are not prohibitive. And this is shown on the next slide, if it works. So these are the average cost of electricity supply in our leadership scenario. That is 100% renewable scenario. These are costs for the 2050 system then. And you can see the generation costs of wind and solar, and then you see additional costs that are about 1/3 of the cost due to grid and storage. And also you see in the remix scenario, in the third one, renewable gas is used as a backup as well. And the total costs are around $80 per megawatt hour, so €50 per megawatt hour, and this is around the cheapest renewable electricity supply you can get around the world. So that clearly shows the power advantage that Australia has, being a large and basically empty island in the tropics and subtropics. This is one bottom line, and the second bottom line of our study is then, if you add hydrogen exports to that picture, the costs of electricity supply even go down. So what we do is we double the electricity demand of the whole system. We blow it up even more. There's no boundary in the resources. Typically, you would assume if you go to higher resources or higher renewable penetrations or increase the system, you have to go to worse sites and then costs increase. But that's not the case for Australia. And so what we're doing is we are adding a constraint that lets all the model generate hydrogen for export, and the model endogenously decides where to put the electrolysis. And due to the flexibility in time and in space of where this electrolysis is being done, the average costs of supply go down. And this effect even increases if we go to a 300% scenario or a 400% scenario. So the 320 terawatt hour of electricity that go into hydrogen are still low. I mean, they're about the amount that Germany would need, but what about Japan and what about South Korea? So this really shows that you can scale it up even more, such that you get in the orders of magnitudes of today's LNG exports. And you're very close there with this 400% scenario. Also in terms of value that is connected to these export streams. We dive a little deeper into the system behind that. This figure is showing weekly averages of supply and demand. You see a white curve in the middle, that's domestic demand, weekly average. And you see the generation coming from solar, wind, and synthetic fuels here. That's a very solar-dominated one. We have scenarios where there's more wind in it from other models, but I focus on this for now. What you basically see is that this oversized system is meeting domestic demand on the site. So in every week of the year, there's more electricity from renewables being generated, much more than there's domestic demand. And the electrolysis is just shaving off the surplus electricity and to feed the hydrogen. It needs short-term flexibility only in this system. If you dive into one winter week where demand is peaking, you see that there are actually these solar spikes, diurnal solar spikes naturally, and it needs short-term storage to then redistribute the electricity such that the demand at night is met. There are several options of short-term storage. There's off-river pumped hydro storage that two models pick as the cost-efficient measure. The remix model of DLR that is shown here is picking battery storage as the source. But the bottom line also from other integration studies is that on the diurnal level, there's enough flexibility in demand in storage of pumped hydro or batteries. And then you still have surplus energy, and the electrolysis, the PEM electrolysis, is getting those peaks. So it's ramping actually, and it's not running throughout the year. This might be surprising if you know the German debate, because 10 years ago everyone was talking about electrolysis living from just curtailed excess energy. And then the German debate changed, and that is worthwhile that it changed, but it's different for the Australian system. So the German debate said, first of all, there's not enough excess electricity. That's different for Australia. And second, the electrolysis need high full load hours to be competitive to get their investment back. But that's actually not true, and I want to show you that in a minute. These are prices of today's South Australian electricity system. We are at 50% of renewables there, and these are prices ordered over the years, so it's a price duration curve. And you see a huge variability already from $140 per megawatt hour down to even negative prices. South Australia currently has among the highest electricity prices, by the way. That is mainly due to the high gas price. And if you have an electrolysis that can flexibly decide on which hours to run, of course, it decides for the low price hours, and so you can have a reduced utilization and thereby have a lower electricity price that the electrolysis sees, lower than the average price. But of course, on the other hand, the capacity is not used as much, so the capex, the specific capex per kilowatt hour or megawatt hour of hydrogen that you produce is increased. And the question is, how do these effect balance? And I quickly calculated this with these costs. Since there's so much uncertainty about electrolysis and how it's developed, I leave it to your judgment. So I assumed 1,000 euro per kilowatt here. That translates into, 1,600 Australian dollar per kilowatt. And what you see in the next graph, what you will see is on the x-axis, it's the full load hours, so the utilization of electrolysis, and on the y-axis, it's the cost of hydrogen. And this is the result. It's an area plot, so two components, electricity input to the hydrogen and the capex in specific terms. And what you clearly see is you don't want the electrolysis to run below 500 or 1,000 hours, because then the capex get prohibitively high. But then you have a flat optimum for the rest of the utilization. So you actually can decide on how much you run your electrolysis. And that's why our model says that electrolysis is being integrated in the NEM, in the National Electricity Market of Australia. It's providing system benefits, and it's not running all the time. And the average cost that we end up here, or in this little exercise that I did here, is 75 euro. So way beyond the 40 euro per megawatt hour that Felix Mattes mentioned before. So that corresponds still to about 200 euro of carbon price. But there's significant learning potential in the electrolysis. It's a modular technology with short investment cycles. Or innovation cycles, if you scale up, that can significantly reduce. For your information, because we're talking so much about syn fuels, I add the costs of methane, so gaseous fuel then, on top of that. There's a hydrogen storage in between, so the methanization gets high followed hours, so the additional costs are rather low. So how do we drive down the learning curves? Clearly by coordination. It has been mentioned several times before. We are summarizing that also in our report. That's the summarizing figure. The roles of the two countries are clear. Germany has two functions in a low carbon world. It's demanding syn fuels and hydrogen in addition to direct electrification domestically, and at the same time, since we are also moving quickly on climate mitigation in all the sectors, and since we have a tradition in engineering and innovation, we can provide clean tech and innovation, and Australia clearly can be an exporter of renewable electricity in different forms, or renewable energy in different forms, and it boils down to a coordination issue of how do we scale that up. The one side needs the other, so they need to communicate. I want to mention that border tax adjustment are probably not very nice, but still this is a way of coordination, because they can create the markets. If the EU is moving toward carbon pricing, and if Japan is having an implicit carbon price when they have an agreement with Australia to only import emissions-free hydrogen, that is implicit carbon pricing, then actually the debate in Australia is not so important anymore, at least when it comes to export, but that creates certainty in green markets and development. So there's clearly policies and a political framework needed to enable those opportunities, and I want to flag that because we comment on that also in our report on policies, the red one that you see laying around. That's it from my side.
Thank you very much. And the clean tech export from Germany is clearly a pillar of the cooperation. From the previous presenters, we can only hope that the building stock renovation of up to 2% per year doesn't take up all the German building tech, because we need it here in Australia as well. And thank you, Falco, for branding Australia not only an island rather than a continent, but also as very empty. Now, a fun fact about this empty island is that here the worst solar resource on the mainland Australia is on par with the absolute best solar resource anywhere in Germany. And that just underlines the fact for our next speakers to come, why does it make sense to produce the hydrogen and that additional renewable energy that is necessary in Germany here in Australia. And with that, I welcome our next speaker, Daniel Roberts to the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to talk about something completely different. I don't know if that's disappointing or surprising or exciting for you. I'll leave it up to you. So I come from CSIRO, and for those that don't know, CSIRO is Australia's national research agency. We do applied research, which really does face almost all of our important industrial sectors, and energy is a big one of those. Hydrogen is a key pillar of CSIRO's energy research strategy at the moment, and my job today, in 5 minutes I was given, is to talk about what that really looks like, and some of the things that we're doing as an organisation with our collaborators across these emerging hydrogen energy value chains from the perspective of technology pathways, both not necessarily those that you can buy off the shelf now, but things that we think need to be developed either from very low technology readiness levels right through to commercialisation in order to really realise some of these various hydrogen energy pathways which we've heard a lot about today. This slide is one that I usually take a lot of time and build as I take people through the what on earth are we talking about this time around as we talk about hydrogen energy. It's a bit of a hydrogen energy 101 slide, and clearly that's not necessary for this audience. I think there's a pretty good appreciation here of what we're talking about when we talk about hydrogen energy systems. What I will use it to do, though, is just give you a bit of a feel for the sorts of things that CSIRO is doing from a research and development perspective across some of these opportunities, and I think try and provide a little bit of context to what we see is coming up next. We are a research and development organisation, and so for us, what you can do now in order to motivate and stimulate a new and exciting industry is really important. But what you do next to make sure that industry is sustainable and viable in the long term is also really important. And that drives a lot of the work that we're doing. And I'll be taking you through some of that in my 4.5 minutes that I have left. And so 80-something% of our hydrogen at the moment comes from coal and gas, and I think we all understand that. And when we talk about these new hydrogen energy systems, we're talking about something different usually. There are some projects going on around the world which are showing how the coal and gas pathway can play a role in producing low carbon hydrogen, and I think many of us here will be familiar with some of those. I think the other pathways are where the people's imagination in particular really does get piqued, and as we start to talk about the production and the export of low carbon hydrogen, we really are talking about renewable energy and finding ways of integrating that with a whole bunch of different industrial systems. And so we had a great demonstration in that previous talk about the role of hydrogen production via electrolysis, not just to make hydrogen to put into your Hyundai or your fuel cell vehicle, but in managing the grid and actually giving us the opportunity to make a lot more renewable energy whenever we can. And I was really pleased to see some of the projected impacts on the cost of power that doing that at large scale can have, because that's something that we've been trying to, I guess, get out to talk about for a long time now, and having some nice quality data to support that is always pleasant. And so we also recognise, though, that the scale thing that we've spoken about a bit today, and I've got a slide on that later, is particularly challenging. I was up in Sydney yesterday with a few of you at the Australian Hydrogen Forum, and one of the presenters there spoke about all the rooftop solar PV in the country would only just be enough to offset the amount of electricity we generate from coal and gas. And of course, in that previous presentation, we saw about some of these scenarios to not just do that, but get to 200% renewables right across our energy spectrum. And so for that, we think we're going to need more than solar PV and electrolysis. Obviously, that's going to be a really important part of what we do. But for us, it's about getting some technologies and some processes that diversify where we get our hydrogen from. Because that really does begin then to bring in industries into the hydrogen space that might not traditionally have played a role there. One that I particularly like is the waste sector. The waste sector is grappling with all sorts of challenges, and I think many of us are across those. There are plenty of technological solutions for doing things with our waste, but many of those need products that attract a pretty high value. And I think as we look to producing as much renewable and low carbon hydrogen to supply the global market as well as our own energy needs, we can begin to look to some of these industries to come into the party and give us some of this hydrogen, which will have flow-on positive effects to sectors that really need a bit of help at the moment. So making this hydrogen renewably at a low cost is a focus for us, of course, although it's probably not our sole focus or our biggest focus, because I think bringing the cost down of renewable hydrogen is clearly on a trajectory that's well underway. In support of this large-scale export opportunity, we recognise, as do most people on the space, that getting hydrogen into a form that you can export cost effectively is quite difficult. There's a liquefaction project going on in Victoria at the moment, and there are some other opportunities as well. We're quite keen on the ammonia angle, partly because we already do an awful lot of ammonia production, shipping and distribution around the world, and so leveraging some of that infrastructure is a real cost-effective way to get early runs on the board. Australians can explain what that means to our German colleagues in the break in this renewable hydrogen space. But there are other carriers as well. And as we diversify these carriers, we begin to bring in other industries which, again, are traditionally really hard to decarbonise. So the ammonia angle straight away brings in the agriculture sector. It's not a cow pill, as we heard about in the earlier slide, but it is an opportunity for renewable hydrogen to have impacts in the agricultural sector, not just in terms of decarbonising the production of ammonia, but also in using that ammonia not just as a fertiliser but as a power source in its own right. And so we're doing a lot of work in those export value chains, and critically we're linking up with some of our international partners to make sure that it's not just about us saying, yes, we can do it, why don't you give us an order for some hydrogen, please. It's actually about demonstrating these value chains, showing that there are markets that can take it and use it, and that we have this partnership with our international collaborators. The challenge of scale is real. We've heard all about it. This is a slide I often use to talk about that. I acknowledge it's probably the biggest of all of the projections of future global hydrogen demand. There are several out there. This is the biggest. I use this to talk about the diversity of the hydrogen, where this growth is going to come from. I don't need to talk about this too much, mainly because I've got about 30 seconds left, but also because clearly, I think this audience is well across this part of it. So I will finish on my last slide on some of the areas where CSIRO, in conjunction with our collaborators, are looking to focus our R&D on to try and achieve some of these value chains, which in some cases are emerging and in some cases just need that little bit more. So obviously cost reduction is key. Anyone that wants to import renewable hydrogen is giving us targets that we have to meet in order to become competitive with what they want to achieve. Now, for us, that's not just about producing the renewable hydrogen, it's also about getting it into a form that you can export and technologies that use it at the other end in a way that's suitable. So, for example, we have some technology work converting ammonia back to fuel cell quality grade hydrogen, very important if the market has a large focus on mobility. But we also have technologies which use that ammonia for power generation, because there's no point in going to all that trouble to make very high purity hydrogen if your goal is to make electricity from that at reasonably large scale. So diversification as well. This notion of sector coupling I really find interesting. We heard this morning, Ross Garneau was extolling the virtues of hydrogen in the steel industry. I think that's a fantastic opportunity that is emerging along with agriculture as one of those sectors that traditionally are quite hard to decarbonise. And the agricultural angle is interesting in that it's more than just decarbonising fertiliser production. This ammonia that we might want to make for agriculture can be used as a power source in its own right. And of course, something that I think is necessary all along these opportunities is demonstration at scale. And that's in particular true for technologies that are still seen as a bit risky or haven't had a large degree of deployment all around the world, but we can see it critical for enabling these value chains on which a lot of our plans and aspirations are based. And so we're looking at the moment to partner up with industry and research colleagues to do some of these R&D projects at scale and link up with our international partners to show that there's a real path forward, not just for the export industry, but for the domestic impacts that doing this sort of work can have. So thank you.
We have one more input from Attilio Pigneri.
He's got no slides though. So
No slides. Do you want to do it, Justin?
However you want to do it.
Then let's come on stage and let's give Attilio Pigneri on the continuing the hydrogen story the first word. Over to you.
So, I've been asked not to bring slides, so I've got the luxury of going a bit more ahead with summarizing some of the things that I've seen in the previous presentations, and I really want to share a couple of insights and, from an entrepreneur point of view, just share one of the main concerns that we have going forward. So quickly to introduce ourselves, we're developing one of the largest electrolyzer projects in the world. It's a 40 megawatt plant, give or take, feeding a 60 tons per day ammonia plant located in Port Lincoln. The project is in South Australia, so the project is very advanced. We're halfway through the connection agreement. We initiate work on the feed, and that gives us unique insights, and we've negotiated a PPA, okay? So that gives us unique insights in terms of how far can you go and where the market is at. We're seeing electrolyzer prices are half of what we've seen in the slides before. We have power price all in below $40 a megawatt hour. So the market is moving fast, and it's moving fast because actually there is a synergy between hydrogen and electricity, which is a bit hard to model, but it's obvious if you look at the slide that we're looking in terms of the average price and the price curve in the South Australian market. We're going through a transition. By the way, calendar year 2019, we're actually seeing the average price coming down compared to the year before, pending on summer. But really, when you have renewables, the best projects in Australia today, are going down to LCOEs of $45 per megawatt hour and an average price of $100 a megawatt hour. So there's a big margin that could be shared between a flexible load enabling a renewable player to actually chase the merchant revenue. And we're seeing that in our ability to get not discounted price, but negotiate how we share the upside of the merchant revenue that we enable for a renewable counterparty. So that's one thing they would like to share. So in many ways, there could be an acceleration. The other insight I would like to share is around scale. We, together with Woodside and FMG, we're members in the Green Ammonia Consortium with Japan, and so we're undertaking some feasibility studies pertaining to the issue of scale as it relates to the export terminals and the ports, but also in terms of trying to put our fingers on what does this mean in terms of renewables deployment in the country. So a full replacement of all the ammonia used in Australia today, imported and produced domestically, will require between 15 and 16 gigawatts of additional renewable capacity. Addressing the needs of just the thermal power generation fleet in Japan, which is what the Green Ammonia Consortium is about, is really repowering the fleet, will require about 200 to 220 gigawatt. of deployment in Australia. So to 100%, and the NEM today is about 50 odd gigawatts, right? So to 100% renewable is not going to be enough. I think 500% is what we need to start talking about. And that's just one country, because we've heard as well that Germany, and this is great news to me, is potentially looking to also import hydrogen from here. And there comes my concern with scale. So I think Falco asked me to, if we can talk about what is the scope for, we want to work together, you know, Germany wants to export technology that it has, we want to buy that technology. If we are to deploy at the scales that we're talking about, we need to be mindful that our supply chain needs to quickly ramp up and industrialize to cater for this. So how do we secure ourselves access to that supply chain? I think is a theme that I would like to throw there. So in import and export in the context of the Green Ammonia Consortium, there's a lot of talks around, well, the first projects, you know, the receiving end, the power plants and the production plants will almost need to build in sync, and there needs to be an underwriting exercise or some other form of bilateral agreement for the production capacity for the hydrogen and the receiving end, because you can't have one without the other. It's the chicken and egg. But if you go back on the other side of the supply chain, probably we need to start, and I think Jeff and Warner would be very happy to hear this. We need to start talking about how do we commit to each other to deploy and build the industrial capacity to support that deployment. Thank you. Then, yeah, and then that is my contribution. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You mentioned that you're surprised about the Germans actually wanting the Australian hydrogen as well, because you already booked it all to Japan. I got the feeling also from the German delegation meeting here, other Australian politicians, that they seem to get the notion that Australia is surprised that Germany wants to buy Australian hydrogen. I leave it with that. We collect a few questions from around the floor in the interest of time, and then you can also put in your comments when you answer these questions. So, first Gabriele, and please keep your questions short.
Yes, I will. My name is Gabrielle Sartori. I'm from Hydromine, which is a company that is developing pumped hydro storage facilities using old coal mines. And I just want to give you an appreciation of the scale of it. So we are looking at 3,000... No, I know, Malte. I know where you're coming from, don't you worry. But it's about 3,000 megawatts and about 40,000 megawatt hours. So talking about scale. So I have a question for Falco, because in your modeling you had some figures about pumped hydro storage firming up the renewable energy sources like solar and wind. So what sort of cost structures do you actually have in regards to those pumped hydros? Are you using those ones that are currently deployed? Are you using, or did you have in mind those ones that are going to be built, like Snowy 2.0? By the way, we can actually do it at a fraction of that price. That was my question.
Thank you. Thank you. Please note down the questions. We take two more here. Yep.
Oh. Thank you. Do you want the question now?
Yes.
Okay. So, as you know, my company is one of the hydrogen makers from steam reforming of methane. Yeah. We see that existing offtake as the best value of your hydrogen from solar as a return to your investment as you're moving towards industrial scale. Yeah. Do you also see us being able to play a role in that? Isn't that the way to scale up your...
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, that was the comment around the 15 gigawatt that we can work together now on, yeah. And
100 to 300.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
We just collect one more question and then we can go to the panelists.
In relation to the models that were presented early on in the panel, just what are the economic growth assumptions behind the models, and would the scenarios, how would the scenario outcomes change if we modelled a steady state or low to no growth economy? And also, how much role is there for offshore wind in Australia?
Thank you. Who wants to go first? Dylan, you raised your hand?
Yeah, well, I can answer the question about the model that I work with on the cost structures for pumped hydro. We just use the input assumptions from the ISP as the default. So they have a capital cost, $1 per kilowatt cost, and a $1 per kilowatt hour cost from AEMO. And yeah, there's actually two versions of, or there's actually multiple versions of those numbers, and you can have a look what they are. I don't know what they are off the top of my head, but yeah, that's what our input costs are. I assume that will be roughly similar for Muriel, the other model, and I'm not so sure about Remix, but that's that question. Just wanted to make a sort of, yeah, it's a comment related to scale, and it's a little bit of a, it's a bit off topic perhaps, but I probably wouldn't describe Australia as an empty island. It's got sort of some cultural connotations here. There's a concept called terra nullius that was used as a justification of essentially the colonisation of Australia. It was on the basis of it being an empty island. So I wouldn't use that term in Australia. And I also don't think, I think the challenges of developing resources at the scale we're talking about are not going to be small. I think that there is going to be some significant social challenges associated with that. There was a question about, I think Colin asked about...
You don't have to answer all of them.
No, but I want to answer this one. So yes, about offshore wind. So that's something that AEMO is going to be including in their next update of the ISP. And it's something that I'm very interested in modelling, particularly because of the opportunities down in the southeast of Gippsland. And yeah, so there is potential in Australia, and we have sort of some preliminary data on that in terms of what it could do and what the resource is, but the costs are very uncertain in the Australian context, that's for sure. But people are definitely, and that's certainly something I'm interested in as well.
Thank you. I will take two questions. Your question on the assumptions. Well, obviously there's a couple of big drivers of scenarios. That's prices, oil price, CO2 price, and so on, interest rates, and growth, demand growth as well. But I think you shouldn't look at it only from the effects of GDP growth in terms of energy demand, but there's also the speed of innovation, the speed of scaling up technologies and bringing down costs is also related to, of course, the growth of an economy. So it's quite hard to say what would be the effect of a low or no growth scenario. I think then you have to take very different things into account, including the speed of innovation. Maybe that's a part of your answer. The second one on hydrogen from steam reforming, is that part of a roadmap? We are in the midst in Germany of a debate on hydrogen strategy and a gas strategy up to 2030 and beyond. And the feeling I got from the discussions we have with government is that might be a part of a pathway as long as it is very clear that is only for a certain amount of years.
That wasn't the question. Yeah, I'll probably quickly answer that.
Okay, then.
Yeah.
Okay, we think of it as being part of a solution, starting with several technologies, including the blue hydrogen, but as long as it is clear that they will be followed by green hydrogen, it might be part of the strategy. Standing alone is probably, from acceptance-wise, different.
And with CCS, I suppose.
So it
makes a huge difference if you...
Yeah, with CCS, that was the blue-grey difference, right.
I think the question was, we're operating steam methane reformers today, can we buy green hydrogen? Which I think, of course, the only thing I would say is that what we're finding, and I think is an opportunity for more technology deployment, is that some of these ammonia plants downstream are 50 years old plus. I think there are a lot of benefits in thinking about the full greenfield repowering of the sites, including the ammonia. So working together on that, because there's actually a lot more value stacking opportunities that you can have simply by, rather than simply feeding the hydrogen. It's the plants are actually much more integrated than simply feeding hydrogen to that. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's take 2 more questions and then let's take the other panelists, give a chance to answer. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Silvia from Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and I have a question about, actually I would like to connect what we heard in this panel with what was discussed in the previous panel on German industry. And I have a question. So we heard that German industry is focusing on, it mostly seems to be investing in synthetic fuels, or at least this is the direction that they are moving towards. And so in any way, they have to import this renewable power in any form, either this is hydrogen or renewable power. And so my question is, if we use renewable power to supply heat to industry, this is, you import electricity and you convert it into it. It's a direct process. When you produce synthetic fuels, you have to convert electricity into hydrogen, and then you have to combine hydrogen with carbon. The carbon most likely is captured, and carbon capture is very expensive, and industry really doesn't like it, at least in current situation. Or you can also synthesize fuels in other ways, but if you synthesize hydrocarbons, seems to me very expensive, more than using directly the power to supply heat. So my question is, why is industry prioritizing synthetic fuels and not looking at both options? So having synthetic fuels, but also having power to heat, for example.
Thank you very much. And over here we have another question.
Guy Dundas from the Grattan Institute. Just a quick question for Dylan or Falco on the Australian research. Have you looked at transmission costs as part of the system costs in your modelling? And did you think about things like space constraints to fit such a large amount of renewables into your, from the model into the real world?
Thank you. And then one last question before the lunch break.
Quick one. So this is for Daniel, just so that he doesn't feel lonely there.
I wasn't.
Daniel, the Syro ammonia cracker, it's been handed over to Fortescue Metal Group, no doubt considerable investment from their side. Can you give us a little bit of details as to why and what's happening with Fortescue Metal Group and your ammonia cracker?
Okay. When are we allowed to?
Yep,
now?
start now.
Okay. So we have licensed that technology to Fortescue Metal Group, which is, amongst other things, an interesting indication as to how the Australian industry is responding to the hydrogen opportunity. We have an iron ore exporting company taking a decision to evolve into an energy company, which is really quite amazing. And they're doing that on the basis of hydrogen as their foundation. And so they approached CSIRO last year. We were at the stage with that technology where we'd done 10, 15 years work looking at a bunch of tech which extracted very high purity hydrogen from mixed gas streams. It turns out that one of the easiest mixed gas streams to extract it from was cracked ammonia. And so we got it to a stage where it was about 5 kilos a day of hydrogen from ammonia. Toyota and Hyundai let us put some of that into their cars last year, which is still driving around. We didn't break them, didn't poison their fuel cells. And the time was right for that to be taken to the next level. And CSIRO does that with partners in industry. And Fortescue were willing to do that as part of their growth into the hydrogen energy space. And so they are working with us on taking it from that 5 kilo a day hydrogen scale to hundreds of kilos a day of hydrogen, which really will address that final step that we have to figure out, which is how to make these membrane tubes, not just with 2 of our guys in the lab spending days and days plating this material, but actually an automated industrial scale process, and then demonstrating it at one of their sites or internationally. So for us, that's a real milestone step, and what it really does is show that there is now a technology across this hydrogen via ammonia export value chain, which can turn ammonia into fuel cell grade hydrogen, which is the last step. And so we're quite excited by what's happening. Thanks, Warner.
Thank you. Falco? Gunnar?
Yeah, maybe since I have the word, I want to apologize, but using the words, I think you know what I meant, that I was referring to the coasts. On transmission costs, I think you better answer. So Dylan is one of the modelers. I was coordinating the group, and Dylan is modeling with OpenSem and open source modeling, which was just launched, so everybody can run his or her scenarios there and have a look into the data. Everything is open source. It's the first Australian open source model, and it's connecting to an open source modeling community also in Europe.
I'm not sure if it's the first open source model, but anyway, it could be, maybe. Actually, sort of related to what you said, you know, you can download and run out of the box, but related to your question, you can't run the 500 or the 200% scenario out of the box for exactly the reason you mentioned. Basically, so the underlying data that goes into the model is from the ISP and the 34 ISP zones, and I actually broke the model trying to make that, because you basically used up all the resources in the ISP zones. So I had to go back and to the, I think it was the 2013 100% renewable energy report, which had a much larger, that had, so there's 34 zones, ISP zones on the eastern seaboard of Australia. The renewable energy project went all over everywhere, so there was much more space available. But yes, all the models actually include transmission, and that's another important but also annoying thing to model. But yes, they do include them. Yeah. I think 21 nodes in our model, and I think maybe 25 in the German one. I'm not sure. 27. Yep.
But that's whole Australia then for the remix model.
Yeah.
I would suggest we do a final, for everyone, a final word.
What about Sylvia's question?
I could answer that if you want.
Good.
Okay. Maybe I can answer a little bit. There is a mixture of technologies when it comes to industrial heat. It's direct electrification, right? It is biomass in our projections, and from a cost-efficient point of view to a large extent. But there's so many different segments depending on the temperature needed, for instance, that will be also other technologies. And we will have a talk, I think, on green steel tomorrow. There's also the possibilities of using hydrogen directly for reducing the iron without the carbon. So there's different processes in the different niches of this temperature market. And by the sheer size of all the energy that is needed, we won't be able to do it with electricity produced in Europe. So there will be an import need of whatever molecules from abroad, and hydrogen would be just a very easy way when it comes to efficiency, or converting hydrogen into other energy carriers.
My question was only why Europe has been one over the other. I know these technologies are all complementary to each other.
Right.
So why Europe has been one over the other?
Thank you. We heard in one presentation that don't focus on 2030 only, look at 2050, the presentation from Karen Pittel. Now, I would like to ask the panelists to put themselves into the shoes of the decision maker who always tries to optimize for 2030, but now exactly going with that question, but one step further. Think about 2050, but what is your next step for the next 10 years as policymakers when you have internalized 2050 is where you want to go? And what is normally overlooked? What do your other policymakers overlook when they just think about 2030? So maybe just give us the 1 or 2 words about your key focus with that 2050 vision, but what has to be done in the next 10 years to get there?
Yeah, so I think it's, with 2050 in mind, we really need to talk about terawatt scale of renewable electricity for exports. And given these past dependencies that we have in the system, there's a limited rate of expansion that you can do in each year or in each decade. So we really have to start very early to get this process going, because we're talking about a very humongous scale. And unless we start now, we won't be there in 2050. So it's really all about speed and coordination to get that stuff into the pipeline.
Very much on the same track. That's the reason for our trip, actually, to come to Australia. We truly believe that it won't happen without some energy carriers, green energy carriers in the future. We have to build up these technologies. We have to build them jointly together, form a global market, so to speak. And there's framework conditions to be defined. There's bilateral cooperation that could be defined. And those are the issues that are urgently needed beyond 2030, but have to be started now. Otherwise, we won't be there.
Basically, if you ask me what I think is overlooked by policy, I think this is already seen by policy. And I think I'm hoping I'm going to be much more happy about German policies tomorrow, because tomorrow is the big decision in the German cabinet about future climate policies. But if you ask me what I think is really overlooked, and that's in Germany and many other countries as well, is really the question of negative emissions. I mean, that was very clear from Gunnar's presentation as well, that we will need that, and we don't really think about it. I mean, all the other stuff is on the radar. It's not necessarily addressed adequately, but it's on the radar. But I think there we do have a really big gap in our thinking still.
Thank you.
How long have you got? There's a lot of things. I think in the Australian context, probably the biggest one is the lack of any sort of transition planning around coal closure. That's probably, if we think about the fact that we've got about 23 gigawatts of coal, much of that will probably come offline in the next, the next 15 years, and then a bit of a drop off after that. This is one of those classic problems. You've got concentrated losses in diffuse benefits of this transition, and no one seems to have got a good grasp on how to deal with that properly. And if you're talking about 2050, that's something we have to do. I mean, we have to do it by in some cases we'll have to be doing it by 2030, but we certainly need to be doing that to 2050. Another thing I was going to suggest that might be more relevant in the German context, because I noticed this on one of the slides, the difference between the idea of technology lock-in. I think in one of the scenarios you end up replacing coal capacity with gas capacity. And then in the other scenario, there's no gas capacity in the high penetration. And I think that's actually that's a thing we need to think about. That's a different thing we need to think about if we're talking about meeting a 2030 target versus meeting a 2050 target, is the technology lock-in effects. But I'll stop there.
Thinking of 2050, I want to add another dimension, and that is climate impacts. We have seen these impressive investment and cost numbers across the studies about Germany. They're all below 1% of GDP of Germany. Not true?
There's some going up to 2%, but that's beside the point.
Okay, then I didn't calculate for all the figures. Okay, let it be 2%. There's a new strand of research looking at the empirical effects of temperature changes on economies. So really purely looking on a basis of empirical evidence on the GDP impacts of climate change. And they're concluding, or their estimates, that are double-digit GDP numbers until the mid of the century if we don't abate climate change. And putting that into relation would conclude for today really embracing that transition and globally.
Thank you. It's difficult for me to comment publicly on policy, but I guess so. In answer to your first question, we will continue to look at technology at all scales that brings down the costs, so that the industry that we're supporting has these opportunities available to them, and we'll continue to do the good science and support those who at all levels of our government are doing really good jobs at putting in place plans to help us do what we think we need to do. I think that's a really good thing. Something, though, that we haven't spoken about in this session comes back to the fact that just because this is a really good idea and we have the technologies that can do all this really good stuff, doesn't mean we're going to be allowed to do it. And I think we've seen it before. It doesn't matter how good an idea is if the community and the people who are close to it don't support it, it's a really hard thing to do. So we can talk all we like about pathways and opportunities and technologies and costs, and what a fantastic opportunity it is for our country in the context of decarbonising the future. But if we don't bring the people along with us, it's never going to happen. And so I think that's something that I know the people I'm working with, in CSIRO, in the governments and in universities are working on, but I think it's worth keeping in the back of our mind that good news doesn't sell itself.
Thank you very much. And it also reflects very much like what I heard in the lunch break, the Australians or the Germans saying, why doesn't Australia embrace that energy superpower position that is brought to them on the silver platter, and why is it not more of a positive story here?
Okay, so quickly in that, because yesterday our chief scientist said we need to live up to that. There is a huge expectation about Australia being that energy superpower. The reality, we need help, we need technology, we need partnerships. But going back to your original question, I feel like it's a game of Chinese whispers. I'm trying to stick to what you've asked rather than deviating. So you said, if you were a policymaker, what do you think about having a 2030 and a 2050 target? If I were a policymaker that genuinely believes into that, I would ask for a 2050 target alone, and for two reasons. The first reason is that actually I need to be able to sell that message to the community. I want to sell it in the simplest possible form. This is my job as politician. But the other reason, if I'm the one, the real policymaker that created that target, I want to make sure that that target doesn't get changed by the next party in power. And we had a recent experience here. We developed a two-pronged renewable energy target, 2020, 2030. We get to 2020, we got the target, just like, oh, let's forget about 2030. And that's a big danger that we want to avoid here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panel. Don't get up yet. Please stay sitting. We have two announcements here, and then we come back to a very exciting announcement on the stage. So please stay tuned. First, Birgit.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for turning out. I'm the Deputy Director of the German-Australian Chamber of Commerce, just in case you don't know me yet. And I just wanted to have a quick chat on the next step, looking forward to the... we are organizing a delegation trip to Germany in March next year. So if you guys want to continue the conversation on energy transition, this is a great opportunity. You may or may not have seen the flyers on the tables out there. So third week of March, we're taking up to 15 people, policymakers, people from industry, from government, to learn more on the energy transition, on the update, what's happening in Germany, meetings with government, with policymakers, site visits, and great opportunity. You can scan the program on the back, or come and see Mareile or myself, and we'll talk you through the program. Great opportunity to continue the conversation. And it's supported by the BMWi, so thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Having been myself part of that delegation to Germany last October, I can highly recommend it. It gives a really nice inside view into the German engineering room of the energy transition. And now we have another German soft diplomacy tool, the green sofa that you might have seen in the lunchroom.
Right, just to give you a bit of background what it is, it's the icon of the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue, which is the major conference of the German government on the topic of the transition, held every year in spring in Berlin. Next year it will be 24-25 March. Just to give you a background, 2,400 participants, last year 55 ministers, so it's really a two-day event, really big. When the conference is not on, we do send around the world literally this one green sofa, carbon offsetted, I have to admit, so yes, we do something also here. And we invite people to sit on it. We take pictures and do with you tweets that we then channel in our social media channel to create the virtual dialogue on your perspective on the energy transition in your respective context. So you have the chance now. We are still here today until the end. So if you have the time during lunch break, please pop by. We do quickly the photo and the tweet, and we would be amazed having you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And after this vision session for 2050 and the scenarios, you probably wonder what is going to be the interactive poll that we prepared for you today for the lunch break. Now, that poll, we did our research this morning, and as you might be aware, von der Leyen, the new EU Commission President, announced that she has the target of making Europe the first continent with the net zero, that achieves net zero. Now, there's one major threat to von der Leyen's strategy. There's another continent that is potentially very close and will be first. So that's not Europe who is first, but it could be Australia. And if we look at Australian state-level targets, Victoria has a net zero emission target by 2050, New South Wales has one, Western Australia has an aspirational one, South Australia, Tasmania, ACT, and we did our research this morning. There was only one state or territory missing, Northern Territory. We changed that. An hour ago, the Northern Territory announced they're going to have a net zero emission target by 2050. With it, so I'm informed. With that information, I leave you to our lunch poll. The question is, who is going to be first, Germany or Australia, achieving net zero? Thank you very much. Enjoy your lunch break. Unfortunately, we went over time. It's clearly my fault. See you back here very soon. Ja, aber leider